Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. You can ask any questions at any time during this webinar by posting them into the Q&A box in your meeting panel. I'll be answering the questions at the end of the presentation. My name is Ihab Sami. I'm the VP of Product and Marketing at Plurilog, and we provide solutions that protect your workplace against identity threats. On today's webinar, I'll be talking about digital identity in the workplace and how that has actually evolved from just a simple user ID and password to understanding the user's behavioral profiles and the impact that that has had on both the user, the enterprise, as well as privacy. Now, to start off on the same page, let's agree on what digital identity means first. Most standards organizations, as well as security professionals, will agree with this definition, that digital identity applies to individuals, organizations, or devices, and it's not just for people. In fact, today, apps have digital identities to talk to each other in cyberspace. But for the purposes of our discussion today, we'll be focusing on individual identity as it relates to individuals, meaning that we'll be focusing on employee identity within the enterprise versus consumer identity, although we will be making references to the latter. Now, in the physical world, an individual's identity is proven through ID papers such as passports, driver's licenses, and other documents. And since that person is usually present along with the required ID to validate, but in the cyber world, we need other means to validate that an individual is actually who they claim to be. And this is going to be part of our discussion today, which is the different means of tracking and verifying digital identity for an employee, as well as the impact that that has on privacy. In order to identify a person and for an identity to exist, there has to be something that identifies this individual and gives them a reference to be referred to. And of course, in the cyber world, this would usually be the username and the password. This is where it all started, actually, when there's a need to identify a user, which was very early on, by the way. The username and password were created at that point. These static attributes were applied only to localized environments, though. So you had a username and password for different sites and corporate environments that you access, which is very much the same today, just slightly different, and there are solutions around it. But now this worked well for a while, as people at that point didn't have that many digital identities to worry about, and most digital identities were more or less for corporate and business purposes, and the consumer wasn't really involved just yet. Then as e-commerce started to take hold, this is where identities for consumers became and started appearing in the spotlight. This is where physical identities started to actually intersect with digital identities. Then of course, fast forward to today, and our digital identities in many ways today have become just as important as our physical identities, because a lot of our physical services and interactions have been replaced by digital ones, which has made it necessary, of course, to link both of them. So to do that, some of our physical identity attributes started making their way into our digital identities. As I mentioned, there's a lot of intersection going on. So our date of birth, government numbers, phone numbers, and a lot of other information have become part of our digital identity. And of course, because of that, a need was found for knowledge-based identity verification. So it wasn't just based on some of that. And of course, most of us know those annoying security questions that we have to pick, remember, as well as answer at most, usually at the most inappropriate of times. I personally don't know about you, but I don't have a favorite book or movie. I've seen quite a few good ones. Now, as more devices started depending on digital identity and more corporations started becoming targets of cybercrime, it became obvious at that point that using static data to verify identity wasn't really enough. And other means had to be used because it was easy to steal the static data, mainly because it became more complex to remember passwords and security questions, and people started writing them down, which of course defeats the purpose to begin with. So other means were used to secure that corporate digital identity, and the focus was then extended from knowledge-based something you know paradigm to a something you have paradigm. And that was where PIN tokens and second factor authentication was born. And these mechanisms were built to further enhance that security. This, of course, gave rise to other methods of verifying digital identity, with biometrics being used to extend that paradigm to something you are. These, of course, as you know, as technology improved, became more prevalent and are actually in wide use today, especially in the consumer space as well as the corporate space, with things like fingerprint and facial recognition being the most common, of course. But the challenge with these has always been that they require hardware to enroll and validate, and could also be stolen or circumvented. Now, in recent years, as computing power has improved and storage has evolved and became cheaper, and with the concept of big data and the tools that look into them have become more commoditized, a new way to identify people started coming out, and that is through their behavior. An example could be that we know that John, for example, it was one of our employees, for example, always browses a few specific websites in the morning before he starts work, or always starts work by checking his email and going through them from the newest to the oldest, whereby Jane, on the other hand, does it the other way around, from the oldest to the newest. So when John comes in and starts doing things differently, it could be a signal that something's not right, even though John has met all the other digital identity requirements that we've supplied, whether it's the password or other factors that are being used to log in. Now, of course, I'm simplifying this a little bit, because most behavioral mechanisms take multiple attributes into consideration when determining or learning behavior, but the concept still stands. And these types of behavioral data attributes could be anything from what you browse to where you are, and naturally, of course, imply that the organization is looking at what you are doing, which has privacy implications, and we'll talk about these in a few minutes. Now, on top of the obvious privacy concerns, behavioral data attributes can also be copied, of course, because if I know John's daily usage patterns, then I can just copy them until I get to a point where there are no red flags have been raised, and then move on from there, which of course is possible because these attributes depend on the what factor and not the how factor or any other factor that cannot be copied. So that brings us to the latest type of digital identity attributes. These are relatively new, and they try to use traits that the user or about the user that cannot be faked or copied, and that is how the user does things instead of what the user is doing. These are called behavioral biometrics, and they're an evolution of the behavioral data attributes without the privacy concerns that we just talked about or the obvious ways to bypass them. These could be, for example, your mouse movements, your keystrokes, the way you walk, the way that you use and hold your mobile device, all of which are no longer knowledge-based, but rather behavioral biometrics-based. Of course, one important point to make here is that using behavioral biometrics to prove identity implies that the person being authenticated is the same person who is enrolled in the first place. So it's still based on an initial learning on the right physical identity, and we'll touch a little bit more on some of that later on. Also, for the purpose of this discussion, we'll be focusing on the authentication applications of digital identity, meaning how we use digital identity to ensure that the right person has the right access to the resources on your corporate network or on your devices. Now that we've set the baseline for what digital identity is, let's look at the different phases and use cases that we need digital identity for authentication for. Think of a typical workday in a corporate environment. When a user comes into the office and uses their static or multi-factor authentication capabilities to log in, they gain access to what they need to do their job. At this stage, their pre-session identity requires basic authentication mechanism. Once logged in, of course, their identity now shifts from pre-session to in-session, which requires a whole other set of identity attributes. And is in fact a big gap today in most organizations, since once a user is logged in, they mostly have access to what they need to without any further checks. But with behavioral aspects of identity as well as continuous aspects of identity, we're going to discuss how this gap can be filled and even improved by monitoring productivity, and even become predictive in nature by understanding the user's state of mind. We're going to dig into that in just a few minutes. Of course, depending on the corporate environment that you're in, there may be a need throughout the day to have other forms of identity assurance. Things like step-up authentication, for example, or other two-factor authentication, depending on what the user is accessing or doing. For example, more privileged or more secure applications or data that need access to, you may need to re-enter your authentication or re-authenticate again. Now, one very important phase or use case that we're going to discuss is what happens after the user is logged out. What is their identity outside of the enterprise? With everything being done online, your social media identity may actually be a threat to your corporate identity, and not just your personal identity. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So let's dig in a little bit into some of these use cases. Before the user is logged in, this is exactly like having the front door of your house locked. It's a very secure state, or at least we feel it's a very secure state because they're outside of our environment, nothing is open, and as long as they don't have the key, they can't come in. At this stage, the enterprise, of course, doesn't know who this person is, and in order to use any other mechanism for authentication, they have to identify themselves first, because we need to get these attributes and understand what these attributes are. And this is where the key comes in handy, because by using knowledge-based authentication, which is still the most prevalent authentication today, such as username and password, along with something that you have based authentication, you can gain relative confidence that the person trying to come in is who they say they are. After all, they do have the key and alarm code to the house, so they must be authorized to be inside the house. This type of authentication is the most basic and it's a requirement for both a regulatory perspective as well as is the first line of defense in any organization. Just because you have cameras inside your house doesn't mean that you can leave the door open. You still do need to keep it locked. Of course, apologies for those who live in small towns where you can still leave your door unlocked and feel safe. This is where enterprises implement pre-session identity checks, even though they are a big risk once compromised. If the credentials or devices or even both get stolen or compromised, then the door is easily opened. And in essence, we don't know who you really are just because you have the key. For users, on the other hand, no one likes to remember passwords or carry around PIN numbers or tokens or get interrupted on their daily work and have to enter PIN codes every time they log into the corporate network. But they do understand why it has to happen and are, for the most part, resigned to doing it just as we're resigned to going through airport security. We don't like it, but we bear through it. Now, on the plus side for the user, though, they have full control of their privacy because they just need to enter a username and password, and the company doesn't know anything else about them. So it has minimal privacy implications or concerns for the end user. Once that door has been unlocked, the user is now inside your network and has access to most of what they need to do their job. This, in essence, is really the most vulnerable state for any corporation. And as I mentioned before, most organizations don't have many checks at this stage, so the user is more or less left to roam into any of the rooms of the house that they have access to. The good news about it, though, is that we know that this person or who this person claims to be, or the keyword being claims, because this person has used the keys to get in, and there is no guarantee that they are the ones that we gave the keys to. They could have stolen keys or even broken into the house. But because we know who this person is supposed to be, we know more information about them, and this is where new identity assurance can actually be used to confirm who this person is, and we can do that continuously as well. Of course, a basic technology that's commonly in use is the concept of step-up authentication, where certain rooms in the house require additional keys to enter. Or in cybersecurity terms, of course, certain applications or resources with sensitive information require that the user re-authenticate once more or use multi-factor authentication once more in order to access that resource. Even though this is a good start, if the user has a stolen key to enter the front door, there is a likelihood that they'll be able to get the other keys to the other rooms. Or, as with most breaches, using lateral movement, an intruder can always move around and explore, as well as further elevate their own privileges until they get to what they're looking for. And this is where newer behavioral assurances can actually be effective. Anyone who's ever seen the Mission Impossible movie, where the way the person walks into a secure environment is used to ensure that they're the right person, the first thing you'll notice is that the characters never actually attempted to mimic that person's gait. It's automatically perceived that it's impossible. But rather what they did was hack into behavioral biometric profile of the user to change that profile to match the intruder that they wanted to come in. So what I'm trying to say is that that the event, so that even even the Mission Impossible guys couldn't crack the behavioral biometric checks. Now, of course, this is Hollywood, but the point is that once we start to track behavior, it becomes more difficult to defeat identity assurance that use behavior as a check or as an identity check. The one thing you will notice is that I'm making a point of differentiating between the what a user is doing versus the how a user is doing something. This is important for privacy, because as we get more into tracking user behavior, privacy will become more of a risk, especially for end users. Now, on the other hand, having identity assurance that are based on how and what the user does together can add additional layer of continuous authentication, which is invisible to the user and can allow corporations to explore relaxing some of the other more intrusive mechanisms, especially during the in-session phase. Now, this in itself makes looking at behavioral technologies worth the risk to privacy, and I'll discuss that a little bit further in a few minutes. Now, notice also the two words that I used, continuous. It's no longer just point-in-time identity assurance, but we're checking identity as long as the user is working. And I also use the word invisible, which is not distracting to the user, because they're just doing what they do on a daily basis and don't have to know what the checks that the checks are happening in the background. Of course, privacy will have to be addressed for these technologies, and the impact will range from low privacy concerns when you're tracking how things are done versus high privacy concerns when you're tracking what is being done. And more about this in a few minutes. Now, as a byproduct of tracking both the how we do something as well as the what we're doing within a user session, it becomes apparent that employee productivity becomes a lot more visible to the enterprise. This is, of course, happening in the active session, where we're already tracking the hows and the whats of that employee. The first, the first thought that comes into most people's minds, of course, is, hold on a sec, we're really going to some privacy concerns here. But just bear with me for a second. This concept is already in use and has been for many years in manufacturing. It's normal for manufacturing, food, and other industries to know exactly what employees are doing at all the time to make the process as efficient as possible. So why couldn't it be applied to business process improvement or employee performance tracking as one of the many types of signals or metrics that are used? Just a thought. And we could also have a completely different discussion about it. But as I will mention later, it is possible as long as expectations are set and compensating actions are taken to justify as well as reward this perceived loss of privacy by the end user. Now, on the other hand, of course, when looking at this from a how you do things perspective, it may not seem as intrusive, although it still depends on the expectations that are being set within your organization or the culture that is within your organization. So in general, using behavioral identity assurances can lead to increased visibility into productivity of within your organization. And of course, that is, of course, if you manage to implement it properly and manage to work around the culture and privacy considerations, as well as perceptions that need to be addressed for this to work properly. Now, if you thought that productivity tracking has some privacy implications, think of the next stage of identity assurance. Once behavioral biometric profiles are built in users based on what they're doing, and even before, And by looking at a combination of what and how the user does things, their state of mind can actually be determined. And by the way, this technology is here today. It's in use every day when you use Facebook, Google, and even some of the smartphones and apps. Even without really knowing who the user is, sentiment analysis is actually a relatively mature technology, but it's mostly being used today to determine what content and ads to show you as a user. But then, of course, when it comes to identity assurance, because we know who the user is already, and we have a baseline for what their physical profile looks like, assuming we're tracking the what as well as the how they do things, then it's possible to detect when a user is not in the right state of mind. And once this is determined, then it's not too far off to recognize the reason why this person doesn't seem to be all there. Now, whether that's for sickness, being under the influence, stress, or being blackmailed by someone, we can eventually tell that this type of information or this type of behavior as long as we have enough data. So this technology, or if you want to be more accurate, the data that exists on users today that allows us to detect this kind of stuff, it can already be used to be predictive in nature. It is very possible today with some commercial HR applications, for example, and analytics systems to detect employees who are about to resign or are looking for a job elsewhere simply because of the patterns of work, network traffic, and the actions that they take. And when a company is tracking this data, they can find out this information. Now, of course, it comes down to what you want to do with this information when you know an employee is doing their job under the influence of drugs or alcohol or under stress. Just because an employee is looking for a job doesn't mean that they're actually going to take it when they get it or that they will leave. So intent has to be determined. And that's something that no system has really managed to predict at this point. So, so be cautious. With and a big cautious approach should actually be taken when using these types of predictive technologies. Also, another consideration for this is that not all organizations are open to this kind of employee transparency. High security level organizations like military or intelligence organizations, for example, can easily justify and implement technologies like this, although it does raise other attack surfaces when you start tracking sentiment as well as predictions for employees with such high-risk positions. But other organizations that put emphasis on culture and transparency may not find this as attractive, and in fact may find it might actually be detrimental to corporate health. There is, however, a middle ground when you start looking at how things are done only and not what things are done, and don't look at and don't look at more identity assurances. And of course, in the end, it all comes down to how much privacy versus security you want as an organization. Now, I won't dwell too much on the post-session phase, but this is usually taken for granted by organizations simply because of the fact that many tools that that these organizations use is going to have safeguards in place to ensure security after the logout or post-logout of a user. But it's always important to ensure that policies do exist to close off user sessions properly, or even if you have a web app, and API sessions should be closed properly to remove any kind of risk of breaches. So the assurance here is really about what organizations don't do in terms of procedure, policies, and processes, and really has the same values and risks as the pre-session identity for users. Now, on the other hand, one extremely important part of digital identity for employees is their identity outside of the enterprise. This is what they do on social media, what they do on the internet, or even their personal lives that may have an impact on enterprise security. You've all heard, of course, that social engineering is one of the most common ways to steal people's identities. This is because people are usually off their guard in social situations. And don't feel the direct link between what they do and its impact on the company that they work for. Actually, an interesting example of how employee behavior outside the enterprise has actually caused a lot of damage was a software engineer who had an active presence on GitHub, the code sharing community for developers. This engineer constantly posted best practices and sample codes on their GitHub account, which was looked on positively by the organization because it showed thought leadership and encouraged their employees to engage publicly, and it showed the organization in good light. However, at one point, this employee unintentionally pasted a code sample that included keys to the company's Amazon Web Services accounts, which no one noticed until over the course of one weekend, someone used these keys to spin up multiple large instances of cryptocurrency mining systems, which ended up costing the company hundreds of thousands of dollars over one weekend. Of course, there are AWS best practices lessons to be learned here, but for our purposes, we care more about the organizational best practices that could have prevented the keys to be posted publicly to begin with. And it shows why your user's identity outside the enterprise is just as important as your digital identity inside the enterprise. As an organization, though, you don't have much control over it or over their external identities and what they do outside in your name. We've all heard and seen stories of CEOs behaving badly, of course, and how that impacts their companies and the companies that they work for. Of course, it doesn't have to mean that your employees that is behaving badly. It could be their external accounts were compromised and damaged in such a way. Their social media accounts, for example, were compromised. So it's important, if nothing else, to have guidance for your employees and best practices on how to deal with their external accounts, as well as their external digital identities, especially because you have no control over it. So if I were to summarize the different identity assurances that we've discussed for our different scenarios and rank them from low privacy impact to high privacy impact, then cross-reference that with identity stages that they apply to, it's easy to see that in order to fill the gap and provide in-session protection, we have to compromise a little bit on privacy, depending, of course, on which method that's used. I'm going to ignore the top three items, so the something you know, the something you have, and the what you are assurances, simply because they're well established and have a lower privacy impact than the rest. And since our webinar is about privacy, I will focus on the how you do it, also known, of course, as behavioral biometrics assurances. We can see that behavioral biometrics can provide continuous authentication because we're constantly looking at how you're doing things, as well as have an impact on multi-factor authentication and step-up or adaptive authentication because it provides a continuous level of confidence for the current user identity. And of course, it is because it's based on how they are doing things. So when it comes time to spot check that identity, whether it's because of access to sensitive information or something else, we can check to see if we are confident that this user is who they claim to be. And if we are, then we can actually skip that spot check, whether that's a multi-factor authentication or a login again, which of course improves the user experience and friction that the user goes through. I've given this a low to high privacy level simply because it really depends on what you're tracking. For example, with Plurilock, we track how you use the keyboard and mouse and not what you're typing or clicking on. So this is in reality a very low privacy impact, as we don't know anything about what the user is doing, yet we can provide continuous authentication for an active session and have relative confidence that the user is who they claim to be. The what you do, of course, will be very similar, but will have a high privacy impact because it will be tracking context and potential private information. For example, what websites you visit, what emails you type, sentiment analysis, and a whole bunch of similar attributes that you could be looking at. Now, of course, the biggest privacy impact on the user are the predictive identity assurance mechanisms. These, of course, require a lot of information about what and how the user does things. And as mentioned, is actually commonly used in HR modeling software today to predict resignations and employee turnover. But what's perhaps more interesting to our discussion is that there are already cybersecurity tools that use contextual data and machine learning to detect and notify, and even better, to predict breaches, malware, and other types of threats. And this is based on previous data within your organization. Some of these are extremely attractive as tools within the corporate network, but once you apply them to user behavior, then a new level of creepy is the immediate response. And fears that people will be pulled away from their desks because the system predicted that they're going to steal data starts to cross the minds of users. But of course, in the end, like any other technology, it all depends on how the organization uses it and how you implement and apply these policies. Now, how you use it plays a major role in how the privacy implications are perceived by your users. So, for example, everyone knows that Google and Facebook use our data to promote products and services, and in some cases even share our data in unscrupulous ways. But does that really matter to us when we're using Google Maps to give us directions to a location that we don't know, or knowing full well that Facebook is going to start showing me cat videos simply because I like that cat video that was posted by my elderly aunt? Many phones today, in fact, actually track what we do and which apps we run and when we run them in order to predict when we're going to be using these apps, and then open them before we tap on the icon so that we get faster response times while the phone at the same time saves battery consumption. And the same thing with browsers. So the precedent of technology predicting what we're going to do is already alive and well, and and in use every day in many of the daily products that we do use. And for the corporation, there are many benefits to tracking some of these privacy, perceived privacy intruding resources. Both from resource and contingency planning to insider threat protection, but of course, that will have to come with a lot of considerations, both from data retention to public relations perceptions. Now, of course, from a legal perspective, most employment contracts give the enterprise the right to snoop on employees as long as they're using company resources. So that's not really the issue here. From a legal perspective, most organizations have the right to do that. The main consideration, though, should be whether the right type of employee for your organization in terms of culture will want to work knowing, or even not knowing for that matter, that everything they do is being tracked by the company. It's always going to be on an individual basis. So there is no right or wrong answer, just based on company and employee culture and what the expectations are. But the one thing that you do need to consider are some of the laws that might take precedence over employment contracts, such as privacy laws in whatever jurisdiction that you're in. So legal counsel and consulting is always suggested in these types of situations. And of course, by using technologies that don't necessarily need to know what the user is doing, you're actually not really having to worry too much about these considerations, simply because you're not really tracking too many privacy considerations. So here we are, right? With regulations such as GDPR, for example, controlling much of the types of data that we can collect and how long we can keep it, and what we tell the owners of this data, as well as what they can request and not request, for example, and privacy becoming a bigger issue for everyone who's using technology. It's important to take that balance into perspective. At the same time, one of the things that's interesting is that the majority, when it comes to consumers, for example, which is where the majority of privacy-related polls actually take place, the consumer perception seems to be inconsistent. The fact that, to me, the fact that 55 to 57% of consumers want laws to regulate how data is used tells me at the same time that 43 to 45% either don't care or don't understand. And this is not an insignificant number. And coupled with the fact that consumers want the government to do something while not doing anything themselves, indicate that that these views are inconsistent and selective at best. Because AI predictive technology is in use every day by the platforms that we do use, and we know that, yet we're still continuing to provide them with that data. And this is because we're getting something in return: convenience, communications, or just attention on the internet. So the story, on the other hand, seems a little bit different when it comes to workplace, though. Even though the enterprise in most cases has full rights through contracts, employment contracts, to collect and track user data, there is a lot less tolerance by end users, which is an interesting observation itself. And it's something that should be considered when deciding on your technology as well as your privacy strategy. So what do we make out of all of this? In the end, there's no real right or wrong answer. It all depends on your company structure, your culture, your regulatory requirements in your area, as well as your business model. If you're an intelligence or a law enforcement agency, your considerations are going to be completely different than if you're a software company. But in the end, the threats are the same. The people people are people. The technology is the same, and this is why we recommend what you're looking at and what you see here. From a legal perspective, identify what data you want to track and why. There is no point in tracking data for the sake of tracking data, because that increases your risk as an organization and exposure as an organization. Understand what your compliance requirements and obligations are in terms of how long you can keep the data, what kind of data you can keep on your employees, as well as what the employee rights are in terms of the type of data that you can keep on them. And one very important point is to keep reminding your users about their legal rights and obligations. And if using monitoring tools, they should know and be reminded that they're in place. However, based, of course, on your company culture, you'll probably need to qualify these reminders. For example, if you're an intelligence agency, you probably already have a lot of strict policies in place, so this shouldn't be too much of a stretch for users. But if you're a commercial company, then more education may actually be necessary to get users to understand how this data is going to be used and how the technology works. This is why Plurilock, for example, provides our end users with end user guides that tells them and lets them know what to expect, with the objective, of course, of making them feel at ease with the technology, even though they don't need to do anything on a day-to-day basis. Even though in many cases they don't even see that the app is running in the background and it doesn't intrude on a day-to-day basis. So, and of course, and one of the things that we do is that we ensure them that we don't track what they type, only the cadence of how they type it. So we always make sure that this is understood by the end user and the benefits that they can get. And of course, taking a cue from the consumer industries like Google and Facebook, who we happily give our data to, try to provide end users with some kind of a reward when implementing new continuous and potentially privacy-reducing technologies. It'll show you, and I'll show you an example in that in the next slide. But one of the most important actions to take, regardless of what technologies you have, is to standardize your processes. Make sure users are aware what these processes are, as well as apply them consistently. For example, if your predictive technologies show you that an employee is about to resign or about to steal some company data, or is already doing so for that matter, one important point is to decide in advance what you will do in response, and know in advance what you will do in response. Are you going to go to their manager and report it? Are you going to talk to the employee to understand the intent behind the actions? Remember, intent is very important here, and no technology can figure that out at this point anyway. In the end, that will depend on your company's culture, but the important thing is whatever action you take must be consistent in every instance of that event, and every instance where you need to take that action. So here's an example of a reward. If you deploy continuous authentication products such as Plurilock, for example, Plurilock Defend, then you may want to consider relaxing some other policies that are intrusive to the end user, such as, for example, some of the password policies, reducing the password rotation cycle, making it instead of every every 10 passwords have to be repeated, you make it every every 20 or 30, or even the password complexity or inactivity timeouts. Or even eliminating some of the two-factor authentication steps or step-up steps. By reducing this, you can actually get your users on board a lot better, because they're getting something in return for that perceived additional layer that you're adding to their security. In fact, some of our customers have integrated Plurilock with their step-up MFA tools that check with Plurilock on the confidence level of our behavioral biometric product that this user is who they claim to be. And if Plurilock has a strong confidence that this is the user based on how they type and use the mouse, then no step-up authentication actually needs to take place. Else, the user is going to be prompted to enter a step-up authentication PIN number or token or password, depending on the situation that they're trying to get to. Now, remember, Plurilock does provide the user with high privacy, since we are behavioral biometrics based and we track how you do things and not what you do. And so by providing the user with something in return, people are more inclined to accept these new technologies. So to summarize, let's look at some of the newer technologies on the market, particularly behavioral and predictive-based technologies. And we discussed how these, how these impact end-user privacy and how to best approach privacy-sensitive applications within your organization. Now, before I start taking questions, I just want to invite you to our next webinar, where we're going to be showing you an overview of the Plurilog Defend product and give you a live demo. So in order to register, just go to plurilog.com and click on the banner on top of the page. And with this, I'm going to stop and see and take any questions that anybody may have. I see a question here that says, what has changed that makes technology available to allow us to predict user behavior? So if I understand the question correctly, it's asking why is it easier now to predict user behavior and to understand user behavior? I would attribute it to one simple thing. It's really the prevalence of big data and machine learning. So the ability to manage large data sets and understand large data sets, as well as computing power, as with the advent of machine learning and artificial intelligence and artificial neural networks, all these came together to sort of allow us to better handle large data sets and better predict and understand some of the some of the patterns that emerge from there, some of the forecasts that emerge from there, etc. Perfect, and I don't see any more questions. So with this, thank you all very much for attending today's webinar. Feel free to reach out or check out our website for more information or for a schedule of our future webinars. Thank you for your time.